Every morning at Fort Lincoln began the same way, the low hum of trucks, the sharp call of reveille, and the steady clatter of boots against concrete. But there was one sound softer than the rest, almost easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, the rhythmic scrape of a broom sweeping across the sidewalk outside the east gate. It came like clockwork, just as the Nevada sun cracked the horizon, casting golden streaks over the sand-colored buildings and the weather-beaten perimeter fence. That's when he arrived, an old black man in a canvas jacket faded to ash gray, boots scuffed and soles nearly worn through, a cap low over his brow, and a long, splintered broom handle in hand. He never spoke. He never crossed the yellow security line. He didn't glance at the guards or the young soldiers rushing past. He just swept, left to right, from the curb to the gate, every movement methodical and sure. If you watched him long enough, you'd notice he had a system. He cleaned even the patches of dirt beside the chain-link fences with a kind of reverence, as though those forgotten corners mattered more than anyone realized. Most people didn't notice. To them, he was just part of the scenery, another piece of background noise in the well-oiled machine of military life. Some soldiers chuckled quietly when they saw him, nudging each other with whispered jokes. The base mascot, someone had once muttered. Probably thinks he's keeping us safe from leaves. But he never reacted. He kept sweeping, his head low, his hands steady, his presence both silent and strangely unshakable. Private First Class Jason Miller noticed, though. He wasn't like the others. Jason had grown up in a military family, his father had served in the Gulf War, his grandfather in Vietnam, and he'd learned early on to look twice, to observe rather than assume. There was something about the old man's posture that didn't match the broom in his hands. It was the way he stood when the flag was raised each morning, feet shoulder-width apart, back straight as an iron rod, eyes locked on the red, white, and blue as it rose into the brightening sky. That was no janitor's stance. That was a soldier's stance. One brisk morning, the air still biting with desert cold, Jason had paused by the east gate, sipping black coffee from a metal thermos. The old man was already there, sweeping as usual. Jason hesitated, then reached into his duffel and pulled out a spare bottle of water. He walked over, placed it quietly on the concrete ledge beside the man, and stepped back without a word. The man paused, looked at the bottle, then up at Jason. He gave a single nod, brief, deliberate, almost like a salute. That nod lingered with Jason long after his shift ended. He began to notice other things. The old man always arrived at exactly 6:45 a.m., never earlier, never later. He never spoke to anyone, but every time a military jeep passed, his eyes followed it, sharp and searching, like he was waiting for someone who never came. When officers walked by, his head would lift slightly, his jaw would set, not in defiance, but with the quiet instinct of someone once accustomed to command. The others didn't see it. They were too caught up in their routines, their phones, their jokes. But Jason did. And the more he watched, the more convinced he became that this man wasn't just some harmless eccentric with a broom. There was history in the way he moved. There was loss in the way he watched that flag. It was a Tuesday when Jason first saw the photo. The fog hadn't yet lifted. The air was still thick and gray, wrapping the base in a silence broken only by distant voices and the occasional hum of engines warming up. Jason was near the gate again, on a perimeter patrol, when he caught sight of the man standing perfectly still. The broom hung from one hand. In the other, he clutched something small, worn, creased, the edges soft and curling from years of being folded and unfolded. Jason couldn't see the image clearly, but he recognized the look on the man's face. It wasn't sadness. It was something deeper. The expression of a man who'd been searching for something that had slipped through his fingers decades ago. It hit Jason in the chest like a brick. There was something sacred about that stillness, about the way this stranger stood there, not as a worker, not as a passerby, but as someone holding on to a memory that refused to die. The next day, fate revealed another clue. A gust of wind caught the edge of the old man's jacket as he bent down to pick up a gum wrapper. Jason, standing nearby, saw it in a flash, a patch sewn on the inside lining, its letters faded but legible, Mitchell. Mitchell. The name clanged inside Jason's brain like a dropped wrench. Somewhere, somehow, he had heard that name before. That night, back in the barracks, he tore through his field notebook. Near the back, in pencil-smudged pages from a training debrief, he found it. Captain Aaron Mitchell. Special Recon. Operation Thunderline. Presumed Kia, 1977. Jason sat frozen for a long time. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. His mind kept replaying the man's face, the silent dignity, the way he watched the gate like a sentinel. Could it really be? Could the man they had all ignored for months be a forgotten hero? Someone whose name had once been etched into briefing slides and memorials. He didn't tell the others. Not yet. He needed to be sure. But one thing Jason did know, as he stared at the name scribbled in his notebook and thought of the man sweeping in the morning fog, was this: the man with the broom was not nobody. He was somebody, someone whose story had never been told. And tomorrow, Jason would start asking the questions that no one else had ever bothered to ask. Because some ghosts don't haunt, they stand watch. And some legends don't vanish, they wait to be seen. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jason Miller didn't tell anyone about what he'd found in his notebook. Not yet. Not even his bunkmate Corporal Davis, who was quick with gossip and quicker with jokes. Something about the quiet weight of the realization didn't lend itself to casual conversation. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something else, something deeper, something sacred. The name Aaron Mitchell hadn't just echoed from a page. It had stepped out of history and swept a sidewalk in silence while the rest of the world forgot. The next morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of Nevada dawn where the sun seemed to struggle through a veil of clouds and dust. Jason was early. Earlier than usual. He stood near the eastern gate, his boots damp from dew, fingers tight around a fresh cup of coffee. And just like before, no, exactly like before, the man arrived. Same time. Same stride. Same old broom dragging its wooden teeth across the concrete in a steady rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. Jason watched him move, eyes focused, every muscle tense with a strange anticipation. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but he knew it was coming. The man didn't notice him at first. Or maybe he did but chose not to. He walked the same route, methodical as always, brushing leaves and sand from the cracks near the fence. But today, something was different. Jason felt it before he saw it. There was a stillness in the air that wasn't just from the weather. A hush, like the world had leaned in closer. Jason stepped forward slowly. He didn't want to spook him. "Morning, sir," he said gently, not even sure why he used the word sir. It just felt right. The man paused, his broom halting mid-sweep. He looked up, not startled, just observant. His eyes met Jason's, and for a second, the young private felt like he was being studied, weighed not by rank but by something far older, something forged in fire and memory. Jason cleared his throat. "You dropped something yesterday. Looked like a photo. Old." A flicker passed through the man's expression. Not fear, not even surprise, just a subtle tightening of the jaw, like someone bracing against a memory. He said nothing, only reached into the inside of his coat and slowly unfolded the object. It was the same photo Jason had glimpsed. 8 men in uniform, standing in front of a smoking helicopter, their faces worn with dirt and resolve. The edges were frayed, one corner nearly torn off. It looked like it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times, each crease a scar of remembrance. Jason stepped closer. He didn't ask permission. "Were you there?" he asked softly, nodding toward the photo. That's a recon team, isn't it? The old man's eyes didn't leave the picture. His voice, when it came, was dry and low. Long time ago. Jason hesitated, then reached into his own pocket and pulled out the page from his notebook, the one with Mitchell's name. He held it out, letting the morning light catch the pencil marks. The old man's gaze dropped to it. He didn't reach for it, didn't even blink. But Jason could see it in his face. Recognition. Pain. Memory rising like a tide. Captain Aaron Mitchell, Jason said, barely above a whisper. Operation Thunderline. They said you didn't make it. The man folded the photo slowly, methodically, and slipped it back into his coat. They were half right, he murmured. Then he turned and resumed sweeping as if the conversation hadn't happened. But something had shifted. Jason knew it. He had touched a thread of something fragile, something long buried, and now it had started to unwind. Later that morning, back in the barracks, Jason sat at his bunk flipping through the old debrief packet again. Operation Thunderline. He remembered the instructors describing it as one of the most dangerous missions ever undertaken in Southeast Asia. It was a rescue op, 6 American POWs, held deep in enemy territory, no official maps, no reinforcements. The team had gone in under deep cover. Only a handful returned. The rest were never found. Their commander was listed as Kia, killed in action. No body recovered. No funeral. Just a line in a report and a name etched into a memorial wall. Jason looked at that name again, Mitchell, Aaron J. What kind of man survives a mission like that, disappears for decades, and then spends his days sweeping the sidewalk outside a base as if he's still on duty? That question haunted Jason all day. Through drills, through training, even through lunch, where Davis threw a crumpled napkin at his head and told him to stop looking like someone ran over his dog. Jason forced a laugh, shoved the debrief page deeper into his locker, and went through the motions like everyone else. But that night, long after lights out, he sat awake in his bunk, eyes open to the ceiling, replaying every detail. The patch on the jacket. The photo. The nod. The way Mitchell looked at the flag. Something was wrong. Not with Mitchell, but with everything around him. How could a man like that vanish? How could no one have noticed? How had the system just let him go? Jason thought about the salute. Not the formal one, but the nod Mitchell had given him that morning by the gate. It wasn't casual. It was familiar. Respectful. It said, "You see me. You understand." And maybe that was what bothered Jason the most. No one else had seen him. But Jason did. And now, he wasn't sure he could stop. Because whispers in the fog don't stay whispers forever. Sometimes they become voices. And sometimes those voices bring history back to life. The morning after the photo, Jason woke earlier than usual. Something had settled in his chest overnight, a kind of urgency he couldn't shake. It wasn't just the mystery anymore. It was responsibility. He had seen something sacred in the eyes of the old man sweeping the sidewalks, something most others had missed or chosen to ignore. He didn't know why it mattered so much, but it did. He had grown up hearing stories about unrecognized heroes, men whose names never made it past local plaques, but he never imagined he'd walk past one every day on his way to duty. And now, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He skipped breakfast, grabbed a cup of coffee from the machine near the admin hall, and headed straight for the eastern gate. The sun had barely begun its slow crawl across the base, and the world still felt half asleep. But Aaron Mitchell was already there, like always. His broom moved steadily across the pavement, back and forth, left to right, in a silent rhythm that seemed older than the base itself. Jason stood behind the fence, watching him for a moment. Then, without a word, he stepped through the gate and walked toward him. "Mr. Mitchell," he said softly. The old man paused, turning slightly. His eyes met Jason's, calm but alert. There was no surprise, no annoyance. Just awareness. Jason held out a small item wrapped in tissue. A folded napkin from the mess hall. Inside it was a fresh biscuit and a packet of jelly. "Brought you something," he said. "I figured sweeping that long without a bite can't be good." Mitchell looked at it for a moment, then reached out and took it, his fingers brushing Jason's for just a second. He gave a quiet nod, almost imperceptible, but Jason felt it like a thunderclap. They sat down on a low concrete barrier near the gate, the broom leaning beside them like a silent sentinel. The biscuit remained untouched in Mitchell's lap. Jason hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was a photocopy he'd made the night before from the base's restricted training archives, a grainy scan of a debriefing slide from years ago. On it was a single blurry image of a young black man in uniform, standing next to a wrecked helicopter, surrounded by soldiers with hard eyes and scorched gear. The caption read, "Captain Aaron Mitchell, Special Recon Unit, Operation Thunderline, Presumed Kia, 1977. He handed it over without a word. Mitchell stared at the image. His face remained stoic, but his hand tightened slightly around the page. Jason watched as his eyes traced every detail. The background. The faces. The lettering. Finally, Mitchell folded the paper once, carefully, and placed it in his coat pocket alongside the photograph. "You were there," Jason said quietly. Mitchell didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted across the base, past the flagpole, toward the training field shimmering in the morning haze. Then he said, "They don't remember the quiet ones. Only the noise." Jason leaned forward. "But you weren't quiet, not back then. You led a classified mission. You saved lives. And somehow, you're still here. That matters." Mitchell's voice was dry and low. "What matters is that they got home." Jason felt the weight in those words. He imagined the chaos of a firefight in the jungle, smoke thick, gunfire tearing through trees, bodies falling. He imagined the fear, the decisions, the sacrifice. And then he imagined waking up years later, alone, unrecognized, swept aside by bureaucracy and memory. It made his throat tighten. "You deserve to be known," Jason said. "They put your name on a wall, and they never even checked if you were still breathing." Mitchell's jaw shifted slightly, but he said nothing. Jason glanced around. A few soldiers passed by, not paying attention. One of them gave Mitchell a passing glance and scoffed. "Still playing janitor," he muttered under his breath. Jason stood. "You don't know who you're talking to," he snapped. The soldier paused, smirked, then walked on. Mitchell placed a hand lightly on Jason's arm. "It's not worth it," he said. "Most people only see what's in front of them. That's enough for them." Jason looked down at the hand. The skin was weathered, the knuckles scarred, the nails short and clean. This wasn't the hand of a man who had lived a quiet life. This was a soldier's hand. Later that day, Jason returned to the base archives. He spent hours digging through old documents, scrolling through digitized reports, flipping through dusty folders with yellowing edges. The further he searched, the stranger things became. Mitchell's name appeared only 3 times, in a mission proposal, a casualty report, and a single memo marked, classified, red level. That memo listed Mitchell as Commander, Team Alpha, and noted that his unit had been compromised during extraction, with no remains recovered. The line that stuck with Jason most was the one at the bottom, Commander listed as Kia. Officially closed. File sealed indefinitely. Why sealed? Why forgotten? Why had no one ever reopened it? He brought his findings to the barracks that evening. Davis was sitting on his bunk, half asleep, when Jason slapped the folder onto the table between them. Davis blinked. "What's that? New reading material for the nerd club?" Jason ignored the jab. "That janitor outside the east gate? That's Captain Aaron Mitchell. Special Recon. Kia in 77. Except he's not dead. Davis laughed. Come on, man. You've been watching too many conspiracy docs. I'm serious, Jason said. I've seen the patch in his coat. I've seen the photo. He remembers. Hell, he still salutes the flag like it's day one of basic training. The man didn't just serve, he led. Davis shook his head. If he was really someone, why is he out there with a broom instead of a pension? Jason didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because deep down, he knew the truth had nothing to do with paperwork or benefits. Some men don't wait for recognition. Some men serve long after the war ends. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Jason made a decision. Tomorrow, he wouldn't just observe. He'd act. He'd go to the command office, file an inquiry, press for answers. Because something wasn't right. A name had been lost in the shadows, and it was time to bring it into the light. The man with the broom wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a myth. He was a soldier. And Jason Miller was going to make damn sure the world remembered. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the soft glow on the edge of the desert sky told Jason it wouldn't be long. He stood at the east gate with his heart thudding quietly in his chest, a man caught between protocol and instinct. Today, he wasn't just watching. He wasn't there for coffee or curiosity. He was there with a purpose. His jacket pocket held a copy of the redacted Thunderline file and a grainy image of Aaron Mitchell taken from the archives. That image, a face burned with grit and youth, was etched into his mind now. The resemblance was no longer a question, it was certainty. He spotted Mitchell at a distance, already sweeping. The old man moved through the misty morning like he always did, quiet, focused, and precise. His broom sliced through the dust and scattered leaves with the same rhythm, left to right, like time itself had kept him on repeat. Jason watched him for a moment, the way others might watch a monument at dawn. Silently, respectfully, with the weight of unspoken gratitude. But the moment wouldn't last. Jason had work to do. He turned on his heel and headed straight to the base library. It was a side building, rarely used by anyone except officers studying for promotion boards or the occasional protocol nerd. Inside, it was quiet, lit by dull overhead lights and lined with shelves that smelled of paper older than most of the recruits. Jason walked past the open archives, past training manuals and maps, to the classified history terminal, a digital archive connected to the Department of Defense's internal network. Access was restricted to sergeants and above. Jason wasn't technically allowed in. But he'd helped the staff tech replace a down terminal 2 weeks ago, and she still owed him a favor. He tapped the screen and typed, Operation Thunderline. A loading wheel spun slowly before bringing up 2 results. The first was a training reference guide. An outline of debrief techniques using real but anonymized mission data. The second was a heavily redacted mission log with a locked content warning. Jason clicked the first. The training file wasn't much, but it confirmed a few things. Operation Thunderline had occurred in April 1977 in Southeast Asia. It was a covert special recon extraction, aimed at recovering 6 American prisoners held deep in hostile territory. The intel had been wrong. The compound was heavily fortified. Extraction turned into survival. The file detailed that only 7 team members made it out, with their commander listed as missing in action, presumed Kia. No name. No photo. Just that line, cold and final. Jason leaned closer, reading again. Commander, redacted. Status, no body recovered. File sealed indefinitely. He felt a chill climb the back of his neck. Someone had erased Aaron Mitchell from more than just the public record. They had locked his legacy in a box and buried the key. Jason sat back and stared at the screen. Questions swirled in his head. Why seal the file? Why not correct the record if the man was alive? Was it because the mission had gone south? Because someone didn't want questions raised about the intelligence failure? Or maybe because once someone's name ends up on a wall, it's easier for the system to forget than to admit it was wrong. He printed what he could, scraps of debriefing notes, mentions of Thunderline in officer lecture summaries, and one mention of a reconnaissance patch similar to the one he'd glimpsed on Mitchell's jacket. Every word felt like a thread pulling him closer to something larger, something buried. By the time he returned to his bunk, his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from clarity. He now understood the weight of what he'd found. This wasn't just about a forgotten man with a broom. This was about a man erased by the very system he gave his life to. Jason didn't sleep that night. He didn't even lie down. He organized the files, highlighted key phrases, wrote notes in the margins. He memorized dates, names, and even the weather report from April 4, 1977, the day the mission had failed and the man named Captain Aaron Mitchell had vanished from history. At 0430 hours, he dressed and went back to the eastern gate. The sky was still dark, and the air smelled of dust and dew. The base was silent except for the occasional truck rolling through. But Mitchell was already there, broom in hand, sweeping the walkway with the same methodical motion. Jason approached slowly. "Sir," he said. Mitchell looked up but said nothing. Jason took a breath. "I went looking." That got his attention. The old man paused. His hand rested on the broom handle, and his eyes met Jason's with quiet intensity. "I know who you are," Jason continued. "Or at least, I know who they said you were. Captain Aaron Mitchell. Special Recon. Operation Thunderline. Presumed Kia." Mitchell said nothing for a long time. His eyes didn't waver, didn't flinch. Then, finally, he spoke. "They got some of that right." Jason stepped closer. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why come here every day like this?" The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy. Mitchell looked out over the base, the flagpole in the distance, the barracks coming to life with shifting lights. "Because this place still stands," he said quietly. "Because they're still raising the flag." Jason swallowed. "You deserve recognition. You deserve your name back." Mitchell gave the faintest of smiles. "I didn't do it for the name." Jason nodded. He understood. But he also knew that the name mattered. Not because Mitchell needed it, but because others needed to remember. Others needed to know that sometimes, heroes don't vanish into memory, they're swept into the background, unseen but never absent. He took out one of the printouts, the old training file with "Commander," redacted, circled in red. "They erased you," he said. "But I won't." Mitchell looked at the paper. He didn't reach for it. He just nodded once, slowly, as if accepting an oath. Jason knew that the man beside him had once held command over soldiers in fire and chaos. And now he commanded something greater, silence, dignity, and the unshakable strength of truth buried beneath years of dust. Tomorrow, Jason would speak to someone who could reopen the file. Tomorrow, he would walk into headquarters with the documents and tell them what they had missed. But today, he stood quietly beside Aaron Mitchell, a broom leaning against the fence, a flag rising in the distance. And for the first time in decades, the ghost of Thunderline stood not in the shadows, but in the light of a morning sun that had never stopped waiting for him. At precisely 0600 hours, the east gate of Fort Lincoln began to stir like it always did, but something about the air felt off. There was a new crispness in the wind, a low tension that hummed under the surface of the routine. The posted guards stood a little straighter, radios clicked more frequently, and the usual easy banter between patrols was missing. Jason noticed it the moment he arrived. Even before his boots touched the sidewalk near the perimeter fence, he sensed the shift. Aaron Mitchell was already there, sweeping like clockwork, his hand steady on the worn wooden handle of his broom. Nothing in his movements betrayed any concern, but Jason could tell he felt it too. The silence between them was different today. Not uncomfortable, just waiting. Jason approached with a nod and a quiet, "Morning, sir." Mitchell responded with the same almost imperceptible nod he always gave, but this time his eyes lingered a second longer. It was as if he already knew something was coming. Then, at exactly 0615, two military police officers appeared from the far side of the security checkpoint. Their boots tapped sharply against the concrete, heads down, posture formal. Jason recognized one of them, Sergeant Holt, a straight-arrow type who followed orders to the letter. The other was new, a young corporal with eyes darting beneath the brim of his patrol cap. They moved with intention, and Jason's stomach tightened. The two MPs stopped about 6 feet from Mitchell. Holt cleared his throat. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the fence." Mitchell didn't flinch. His broom stopped moving, but he remained standing tall, his face unreadable. Jason stepped closer instinctively. Holt continued, his voice flat but firm. "New orders came down this week. No unauthorized civilians are allowed to linger near base entry points. That includes daily activity beyond the yellow perimeter line. I'm afraid you'll have to move along." Jason opened his mouth, but Mitchell held up a hand, silencing him without words. He turned to Holt, his voice calm and low. "I've been cleaning this sidewalk every morning for over 15 years. "I understand that, sir," Holt replied, shifting slightly, not quite at ease. "But the new base commander has issued a perimeter integrity protocol. No exceptions." Jason stepped forward, ignoring the tightening knot in his chest. "This man is a veteran," he said, his voice rising. "You can't just throw him out." The younger MP glanced nervously between Jason and Mitchell, while Holt stiffened. "Private Miller, you're out of line." "With respect, Sergeant," Jason said, standing straighter, "you don't know who you're talking to." Mitchell placed a hand on Jason's shoulder and gave it a small squeeze. Then, without a word, he leaned his broom carefully against the fence and bent to gather his things. Jason watched as he picked up a plastic bucket with a few rags, a folded jacket, and a small weathered satchel that looked like it had traveled through more miles than most men had walked in a lifetime. Just as he lifted the satchel by the strap, the zipper caught on the edge of the bench and snapped open. What happened next unfolded in slow motion. A metal box slipped from inside the satchel and clattered onto the concrete. It hit hard and bounced, its lid flipping open as it landed. Everyone froze. The world narrowed to that small rectangle of scratched silver now lying exposed in the pale morning light. Inside, nestled against a piece of old cloth, were several items that did not belong to someone forgotten or dismissed. First was a silver star, dulled by time but unmistakable in shape and honor. Next was a frayed unit patch, its edges singed and threads faded, but still clear enough to read, "Special Recon, Thunderline." And beneath it, tucked beneath the edge of the cloth, was the photograph. The same one Jason had seen days earlier. 8 men in uniform. A helicopter burning in the background. Eyes hard with survival. Faces that had long been ghosts in government files. The silence stretched as the weight of recognition settled. The younger MP took a small step forward. "Sir," he said softly, "is that real?" Before Mitchell could respond, another soldier approached, drawn by the commotion. He wore a logistics patch and looked barely older than Jason. His eyes locked on the patch in the box, and his face paled. "I've seen that before," he whispered. "In a briefing packet last year. That's Thunderline. That mission went sideways. They lost almost everyone." Jason turned sharply. "What did you say?" The soldier pointed to the photograph. "That guy, if this is who I think it is, he wasn't just some soldier. He was the mission commander. They said he never came back." Jason crouched beside Mitchell, who had silently begun to gather the spilled contents of the box. His hands were careful, almost ceremonial. Jason locked eyes with him, Sir, he said, voice tight, were you Thunderline? Mitchell paused, one hand resting on the folded photograph. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past Jason toward the gate, toward the rising flag in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but resolute. Not everyone made it. But someone had to stay behind to make sure the others did. Jason stood, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He turned without waiting and sprinted toward the headquarters building, the words still ringing in his mind. He didn't stop to salute. He didn't knock. He pushed through the admin office doors and headed straight to the desk of Captain Walters, his unit CO. She looked up, startled. Miller, what the hell? I need 5 minutes, he said, out of breath. It's important. We've been ignoring someone who shouldn't have been forgotten. Back at the gate, Mitchell stood up slowly, his box now closed again, its contents safely secured. The MPs remained silent. Across the base, phones began to ring. Quiet conversations turned urgent. In a small secure room, a general's aide picked up the phone and spoke just one sentence. You're going to want to see this in person, sir. And with that, the wind changed again at Fort Lincoln, as something long buried began to rise. Aaron Mitchell, the man with the broom, was no longer just a figure in the morning mist. He was a name the army had lost. And now the army was about to remember. The silence inside Captain Walters' office was as thick as the desert heat outside, even with the blinds drawn and the AC humming faintly. Jason stood in front of her desk, posture firm, adrenaline still racing through his system. The captain watched him, arms crossed, her expression shifting slowly from irritation to focus. She had seen that look in a young soldier's eyes before, the mix of urgency, conviction, and just enough fear to signal this wasn't about excuses or games. She motioned for him to speak. Jason laid the folder on her desk like it was an offering to something sacred. Ma'am, I believe we have someone on base who's been misidentified for over 40 years. Captain Aaron Mitchell. Special Recon. Operation Thunderline. She raised an eyebrow, flipped the folder open, and scanned the printed documents inside. Photos, redacted files, a highlighted mission report, and most damning of all, the name, Commander. Redacted, paired with a blurred image of the very man who had swept their sidewalks every morning. Her eyes paused on the image. Where did you get this? The base archive. Training files and digital logs. The mission was sealed, but parts of it slipped into secondary records, lecture notes, case studies. The files were stripped of names, but the photos, the man in that picture is the same one outside the East Gate. I'd bet my life on it. Captain Walters leaned back slowly. She glanced again at the page, then up at Jason. And you're sure? Yes, ma'am. His patch matches the mission. He carries a photo of the Thunderline team. Today, I saw his silver star. He didn't tell me anything directly, but he didn't have to. I know it's him. Walters exhaled through her nose, the weight of what he was saying settling heavily between them. Thunderline was classified. Deep black. Command lost half that team and buried the rest under paperwork and silence. If you're right, Private Miller, this isn't just a footnote in some forgotten file. It's a breach of history. Jason nodded. With respect, ma'am, it's more than that. It's a man who gave everything and got left behind. She stood, picked up the phone, and dialed a number Jason didn't recognize. Her voice was clipped, precise. Get me Colonel Rohr. An alert security, non-emergency. We need quiet eyes on the East Gate. No action, just observation. And contact JAG. We might be stepping into something delicate. Jason was dismissed, but not before she gave him a final instruction. Say nothing. No rumors, no whispers. This stays in the chain of command until we have confirmation. Understood? Yes, ma'am. As Jason exited, the halls buzzed just slightly louder than before. Officers moving faster, phones ringing in unusual succession. Something was shifting across the base, he could feel it. Meanwhile, out at the eastern gate, Aaron Mitchell resumed his quiet work. The incident with the MPs had drawn eyes, but no one disturbed him after that. The old man simply returned to his bench, broom leaned against the chain-link fence, satchel by his side. He looked calm, as always, but his fingers fidgeted over the photograph inside his coat, brushing it like a talisman. Unbeknownst to him, his presence had triggered a chain reaction inside Fort Lincoln. In a secured data room deep in the admin wing, a technician cross-referenced Jason's findings against declassified personnel records. A file long presumed closed pinged open, Mitchell, Aaron J., status, Kia, 1977. Underneath it, several scanned documents slowly came into view, enlistment forms, mission prep briefings, and a personnel photo that matched Jason's printout with uncanny accuracy. Next came handwriting samples, service medals, medical files, and field debrief reports. As the data pieced together like an old puzzle, the system began to align. The man sweeping the sidewalks outside Fort Lincoln was not a mystery. He was an error in the record. A ghost the system had once declared dead and then chosen to forget. By late afternoon, the whispers had grown louder, though they still moved behind closed doors. There were quiet meetings in conference rooms. Email strings marked with red headers. A small committee was convened to confirm the findings. Colonel Rohr, recently appointed, reviewed the material with a furrowed brow and a clenched jaw. He was a man of order, and this was chaos. But even he couldn't deny what the documents revealed. And then, at 1,700 hours, a black SUV with no military markings pulled through the secondary checkpoint and parked near the main command building. Out stepped a general. Not just any general, Richard Hawthorne, one of the few living veterans of Operation Thunderline. He wasn't expected. He didn't call ahead. He didn't need to. He walked like a man who had waited 40 years for this moment. Word spread like a shockwave. Officers snapped to attention. MP radios clicked to private channels. No announcements were made, but everyone felt the change. The general had arrived, and for a reason no one yet dared to say out loud. General Hawthorne entered the command building with silent authority. Colonel Rohr met him at the door, eyes wide. "Sir, I wasn't aware." "You wouldn't be," the general said. "Where is he?" Rohr hesitated, then gestured toward the east gate. "Still there. Hasn't moved." Hawthorne nodded. "Good. Don't move him now. Don't say a word. I'll go to him." Across the base, windows filled with watching eyes. The general walked alone, his dress shoes clicking against the concrete, the wind tugging slightly at the corners of his coat. No aide followed him. No press. Just an aging man heading toward something that had haunted him every day since 1977. When he reached the gate, he stopped a few feet from Aaron Mitchell, who was now standing with his back turned, wiping down the bench where he usually sat. "Aaron," the general said softly. Mitchell paused. Slowly, he turned. For the first time in over 4 decades, two men who had once stood in jungle mud beneath burning skies looked each other in the eyes again. Mitchell's mouth parted slightly, surprise flickering across his face, then something older and deeper, recognition, pain, relief. General Hawthorne removed his cap and pressed it to his chest. "Is it really you?" Mitchell nodded, his voice barely audible. "Thought you'd forgotten." Hawthorne stepped forward, voice cracking. "I never did. I saluted your name on the wall every year. But they told me you were gone." "I was," Mitchell said. "Just not the way they thought." Behind them, silence fell across the gate. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. Two old soldiers, standing face to face, surrounded by the echoes of a war they had never truly left. The truth had been unsealed. And now, Fort Lincoln would never be the same. The moment General Hawthorne stepped through the gates of Fort Lincoln, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, a quieting of voices, a ripple in the usual cadence of the bass. Soldiers straightened. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Even the desert wind seemed to draw its breath. It had been years since a four-star general set foot here without ceremony, without warning, without fanfare. And yet there he was, walking with a limp that time hadn't healed, his chest heavy with medals and memory, eyes locked ahead like a man finally closing a chapter he never meant to leave unfinished. He passed rows of saluting officers without returning the gesture, not out of disrespect, but because his focus was singular. His eyes searched the far edge of the base, beyond the flagpole, beyond the security checkpoint, where a lone figure stood in shadow. Aaron Mitchell. The man whose name was etched on the black marble wall at headquarters. The man whose death had been grieved, filed, and quietly forgotten. The man who, somehow, was still standing. Mitchell hadn't moved from his usual place by the bench. His broom leaned beside him, hands folded behind his back, shoulders square. He had seen the SUV arrive. He had seen the general step out. And he had known, before a single word was spoken, that the past had finally found him. The general approached slowly, his steps measured not by pain but by reverence. Around them, soldiers gathered in small clusters. No one spoke. No one dared. Jason stood among them, his heart pounding, every nerve lit with anticipation. This was the moment he had hoped for, the moment he had fought to bring about. But now that it was happening, he could barely breathe. Hawthorne stopped a few feet from Mitchell and removed his cap. His hand trembled slightly as he held it over his chest. His voice, when it came, was raw, lined with decades of unspoken grief. "Captain Aaron Mitchell," he said. "Is that really you?" Mitchell looked at him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if to make sure the man before him wasn't a ghost. Then he nodded once. "You've aged, Richard." A faint smile tugged at the corners of Hawthorne's mouth. "So have you. But I'd know those eyes anywhere." There was silence then. A silence so complete it drowned out the noise of the bass, the hum of trucks, the metallic echo of morning drills. It was the silence of recognition. Of something sacred. "I thought you died with the others," Hawthorne said. Mitchell nodded again. "I did. In the way they needed me to. Someone had to stay. Someone had to make sure they got out." The general's jaw clenched, and for a moment it seemed like he might crumble. But he didn't. He stepped forward, and with deliberate grace, he lifted his hand and delivered a full formal salute. Not the kind given out of obligation. This was a salute reserved for heroes, for legends, for the few who stood when others fell. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jason felt his chest tighten, his breath caught somewhere between awe and sorrow. He looked around and saw the expressions on every face shift from confusion to reverence. The man they had called janitor, who swept sidewalks in silence, was now standing with a general salute upon him. Then, slowly, like a wave rolling across the base, soldiers began to stand taller. One by one, they raised their hands in salute. Young recruits, weathered sergeants, officers in dress and fatigues. Even the MPs who had once ordered Mitchell away now stood motionless, their hands to their brows. A mechanic dropped his wrench and stood straight. A cook stepped out of the mess hall doorway, wiping his hands, his eyes wide with disbelief. Everyone saluted. Jason stood at the edge, frozen, then lifted his hand too. He wasn't saluting rank. He was saluting truth. Mitchell's hand rose slowly, trembling slightly, but sure. He returned the general's salute, and in that moment, a chapter of history long buried came roaring back to life. Hawthorne lowered his hand, his voice hushed but clear. "Your name was carved on the wall. I've saluted it every year. But it wasn't your time, was it?" Mitchell shook his head. Not then. Hawthorne turned to face the crowd. His voice rose, strong and commanding, the way it had been decades ago in the jungle. This man is not a janitor. He is Captain Aaron Mitchell. Special Recon Unit. Presumed Kia during Operation Thunderline. A murmur swept through the crowd, disbelief chased by awe. He didn't die, the general continued. He stayed behind so we could live. He gave us every breath we have. And we never knew. He paused, then took a step back and faced Mitchell again. Captain, I owe you my life. No one moved. No one spoke. Mitchell didn't reply with words. He simply nodded, and that single motion carried the weight of everything he had endured, everything he had lost, and everything he had never asked for. The two men stood like bookends of a forgotten era, one polished by ceremony, the other worn by time, and yet both bound by honor that had never faded. When the crowd finally stirred, it wasn't with noise. It was with reverence. Soldiers lowered their hands slowly, respectfully, some with tears they tried not to wipe away. No one laughed. No one joked. Every person who had ever walked past Aaron Mitchell without seeing him now looked at him and understood. Jason stepped forward, heart still thudding. Mitchell saw him and gave the same nod he had given on that first morning with the bottle of water. But now it meant something else. It meant, you did it. That night, Fort Lincoln didn't sleep easily. Conversations hummed through the barracks, through officers' quarters and the mess hall. Phones rang in Pentagon offices. Files once locked away were requested, reviewed, and reopened. Something had shifted forever. The man who had been forgotten was forgotten no more. And somewhere beyond the lights of the base, under a sky full of stars that had witnessed both silence and truth, the legacy of Aaron Mitchell began to rise, not with headlines or speeches, but with the quiet power of a salute long overdue. By the next sunrise, Fort Lincoln was no longer the same. The base still bustled with drills, routine checks, and the shrill calls of early morning roll calls, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. Whispers followed every soldier who passed the east gate, whispers wrapped in disbelief and reverence. They all knew now. The man they had dismissed, laughed about, ignored for years, the man with the broom, had been a captain. Not just any captain, but a leader from one of the most harrowing covert missions ever undertaken. A ghost the system had buried and never expected to see again. And now, that ghost stood at attention in the living flesh. Jason arrived at the gate earlier than usual. His boots tapped quietly along the sidewalk, eyes drawn instinctively to the same worn bench where Aaron Mitchell stood, broom at his side, posture erect, as if nothing had changed. Except everything had. The air around him carried new weight. Soldiers who once barely noticed him now passed with cautious glances or straightened backs. Some whispered. Others avoided eye contact out of shame or uncertainty. But none dared to joke. Mitchell didn't seem fazed by the attention. He moved with the same quiet purpose, sweeping in deliberate strokes, pausing only to nod when someone acknowledged him. His expression hadn't changed, but Jason could tell something inside him had. Not pride. Not relief. Something deeper. Something more solemn. Like a man who had carried the burden of silence for so long that its release didn't bring comfort, only clarity. At 0700 sharp, a small formation gathered near the command building. Officers, MPs, and select soldiers had been called together without much explanation, though everyone knew why. The command staff had prepared no speeches, no banners, no press. Just a formal recognition, stripped of spectacle, as if the silence around Mitchell demanded it be honored in kind. General Hawthorne stood at the head of the formation in full dress uniform. The medals on his chest gleamed under the pale sun, but his face remained grave. His eyes tracked Mitchell as he approached, his stride measured, his head high, not with arrogance, but with the dignity of a man who had never stopped serving, even when no one remembered. Captain Walters stepped forward first, clearing her throat. "Captain Aaron Mitchell," she said, her voice steady but soft, "we're here today not to restore your honor, because it was never lost. We're here to recognize it. Officially. Finally." She extended her hand. Mitchell looked at it, then shook it, his grip firm, his eyes unreadable. Colonel Rohr followed, holding a sealed envelope. "The Department of Defense has initiated a full investigation into your service record. Your name has already been removed from the Kia registry, and a formal review of Operation Thunderline is underway. You'll be contacted by a liaison to process all veteran entitlements that were denied or overlooked." Mitchell didn't flinch. "I'm not here for the money," he said quietly. "I know," the colonel replied. "But it's yours. Every part of it. And more than that, the truth is yours." Then General Hawthorne stepped forward. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood before Mitchell, eyes heavy with memory. When he finally did speak, his voice cracked with emotion that no amount of rank could hide. "48 years ago, I watched your name carved into stone. I believed I was saluting a man we'd lost. But it turns out, I was saluting a man who kept standing long after the rest of us went home. I owe my life to you, Aaron. And I know I'm not the only one." He turned to the assembled soldiers. "This man saved 7 of us. He stayed behind when the evac zone was overrun. He fought until we were airborne. He disappeared into the jungle, wounded, left for dead. And yet he survived. Alone. For years. And when he came home, no one saw him. But he kept showing up anyway. Every day. Because that's what honor looks like when no one's watching." The silence that followed was sacred. Then, as if called by something greater than protocol, General Hawthorne stood to attention, drew in a breath, and saluted once more. Not the brief, practiced motion of military formality, but a deep, deliberate salute held for several long seconds. Mitchell returned it, slower, his hand trembling slightly, but steady enough to speak volumes. And then it happened. One by one, soldiers began to raise their hands. Not in command, not in ritual, but in reverence. A silent cascade of salutes. From officers to privates, from kitchen staff to engineers, from veterans in the crowd to cadets who had never seen combat but now understood sacrifice in a way their textbooks never taught. Even base personnel from the motor pool stood by their trucks, saluting from a distance, caps removed and held over their hearts. Jason stood among them, tears brimming in his eyes, his arm raised with pride. He didn't look at anyone else. His gaze stayed on Mitchell, who now stood fully seen, fully acknowledged, not as the quiet old man by the gate, but as the soldier who never stopped standing watch. When the final salute was lowered, no one moved. No one clapped. No one cheered. Instead, a silence filled the courtyard like a hymn. It was deeper than applause, more powerful than ceremony. It was the collective voice of respect, spoken without words. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Jason walked over to the bench where Mitchell had returned, broom once again in hand. He sat beside him in the shade of the guard tower, watching the flag flutter gently in the breeze. "You okay?" Jason asked quietly. Mitchell nodded. "Didn't expect all this." Jason smiled. "They didn't either. But they needed it." Mitchell looked out at the base, at the soldiers now going about their day with just a little more awareness. "I didn't come back for a salute," he said. "I just didn't want the flag to fly alone." Jason didn't reply. He didn't need to. Because sometimes, the most heroic acts aren't written in headlines. They're written in footprints across concrete, in silent mornings, in brooms sweeping sidewalks while memories march through fog. And sometimes, the greatest salute is not the one given, but the one finally returned. The sun was sliding low over the rooftops of Fort Lincoln when Jason knocked gently on the door of the small office in the corner of the admin building. It wasn't one of the fancy spaces with polished plaques or a secretary at the desk. This one had no name on the door, no rank listed, just a dull brass knob and a flickering overhead light. Behind it sat Aaron Mitchell, for the first time in decades not on a bench or a sidewalk, but in a room made available by order of the general himself. A quiet space, private and unadorned. Just 4 walls, a desk, a chair, and a file box labeled "Recovered Documents." Mitchell looked up as Jason stepped inside. His eyes were calm, his posture upright. The same man, but something about him felt heavier now. Not burdened, but filled with the weight of memory, as if the layers of time had peeled back just enough to let everything come flooding in. "You don't have to do this," Jason said, his voice quiet. "I know," Mitchell replied. "But someone should hear it. Before it gets rewritten again." Jason took a seat across from him, a notebook in hand but closed. He wasn't there to take notes. He was there to listen. Mitchell stared at the far wall for a long moment before speaking. It was April 1977. Thunderline wasn't supposed to go the way it did. We'd trained for months, had intel briefings every night for 2 weeks leading up to insertion. 6 American prisoners held at an enemy compound deep in the jungle. Our job was to get in before dawn, extract all 6, and rendezvous at the LZ for helicopter evac. He paused, his fingers tracing a crease on the edge of the desk, eyes distant. Intel said the camp was lightly guarded. It wasn't. We landed just outside the perimeter and got hit before we cleared the first 50 yards. Automatic fire from the tree line. Trip mines near the paths. They knew we were coming. Jason sat still, trying not to breathe too loudly. We pushed through. Had to. Got inside, neutralized the perimeter guards, found the prisoners chained in a wooden longhouse. They were in bad shape, malnourished, wounded, scared. But alive. We got them out, carried one who couldn't walk. I remember the sound of their chains rattling even after we'd cut them loose. He exhaled slowly, his jaw clenching. We were supposed to have 2 birds for evac. One for the team, one for the prisoners. But the LZ was hot. First chopper came in under fire. Took damage on the way out but lifted. Second bird never made it. Shot down 2 clicks from the ridge. Pilot didn't make it. I called in that we had 1 lift left. I made the call to load the prisoners and send my team. I stayed behind. Jason felt the words hit him like weight dropping onto his chest. I had 3 rounds left in my M4 and 2 grenades, Mitchell continued. Set charges along the approach path, moved into a hollow under the ridge, and waited. When they came, 3, maybe 4 dozen, I let them get close, real close. Then I opened up. His voice dropped, softer now. Took 2 rounds in the shoulder and 1 through the side. Fell backward into the ravine behind the outcrop. Must have hit my head on the rocks. Everything after that is haze. Jason leaned forward. How long were you out there? 2 years, Mitchell said. Maybe a little more. They found me during a prisoner exchange in late '79. I was in a camp near the Mekong Delta. No tags. No uniform. I destroyed all of it after the evac to avoid being identified if captured. They called me John Doe 47. Sent me to a VA hospital under that name. Jason swallowed hard. No one recognized you. I didn't recognize myself, Mitchell admitted. Memory was broken. Names, faces, all scrambled. I couldn't even remember Thunderline until I heard the word again on a television in a waiting room in '85. By then, I was long gone. Drifted from job to job, trying to hold on to scraps of something I didn't know how to explain. He looked at Jason directly now. And by the time it came back, really came back, it was too late. My unit was gone. File closed. I tried to reach out once. Wrote a letter to the Department of the Army. Never heard back. Figured they thought I was crazy. Maybe I was. Jason's voice cracked. But why didn't you fight harder? Go public? Call someone? Mitchell smiled faintly. Because I wasn't the story. The men who didn't make it, Sergeant Kelly, Private Dupree, Lieutenant Harris, they were the story. I failed them. I got them into that mess. Some part of me believed I didn't deserve to come back. Jason's hands gripped the edge of his chair. But you did come back. You saved them. You lived. That should have mattered. It mattered to me, Mitchell said, his voice steady again. That's why I came here. I just wanted to be near the flag. To raise it in the morning. To make sure it never flew without someone watching. Jason couldn't speak. His throat felt tight, his eyes stinging. Mitchell leaned back. I never needed anyone to salute me. I needed to remember why I saluted in the first place. They sat in silence for a while after that, the room holding the weight of the story like a sacred space. Finally, Jason stood, walked around the desk, and extended his hand. Mitchell rose and shook it. Not as soldier to soldier, but as something deeper. Witness to truth. Bearer of legacy. As Jason stepped out into the hallway, the sound of the flag outside caught his ear, flapping gently in the wind. He turned to look back one last time. Inside that small room sat a man who had returned from the dead, not in body, but in memory. A man who had carried history on his shoulders and laid it down, piece by piece, so the world could finally remember. Captain Aaron Mitchell had told the truth. And now it could never be forgotten. The ceremony was modest, almost too modest given the gravity of what it meant. No reporters, no broadcast cameras, no grand procession of dignitaries or ribbon-cutting moments. Just a quiet gathering beneath the morning sun, where a handful of officials, a few dozen soldiers, and a single American flag stood as silent witnesses to a moment the military almost never prepared for, the return of a man long believed to be dead. Fort Lincoln had rearranged the schedule for the morning. No drills, no briefings, no operations until after 0800. All attention was directed to the west courtyard, where a folding table had been covered in a ceremonial blue cloth and a wooden podium waited patiently in the middle of the concrete square. Jason Miller stood near the back, his hands clasped behind his back, uniform freshly pressed, breath tight in his chest. He wasn't supposed to be nervous. He wasn't even the one being honored. But as he watched Aaron Mitchell step quietly into the courtyard with the same slow gait he used when sweeping the sidewalks, he felt a swell of something between pride and awe. Mitchell wasn't in dress blues. He had declined the uniform offered to him. Instead, he wore the same faded jacket and boots he always had, patched and worn, a man untouched by ceremony and unbothered by appearances. General Hawthorne stood at the podium and waited until Mitchell approached. The base fell into silence again, like it had during the salute. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the breeze seemed to still. Today, Hawthorne began, we correct a record. Not just a clerical one, but a moral one. In 1977, during Operation Thunderline, Captain Aaron Mitchell led his team into hostile territory on a mission that most of us would never speak of again. He was presumed killed in action, his name entered into our system as a loss, his body never recovered, his service never fully honored. And yet, Captain Mitchell did not die. He endured. He survived. And for 40 years, he lived among us, unseen. Hawthorne's voice tightened slightly. We failed him. Not once, but many times. We failed to bring him home. We failed to ask the right questions. And we failed to remember that heroes don't always return with fanfare. Sometimes, they return quietly, with no demand for recognition, only a desire to serve. He turned toward Mitchell, lifting a small black box from the table. On behalf of the United States Army, and by authority vested in me as Commanding General, I hereby present the Restored Service Medals to Captain Aaron Mitchell. The Silver Star for Gallantry in Action. the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty. Mitchell stepped forward and accepted the medals, one at a time. He said nothing, but the way his hand closed over each ribbon, the way his shoulders squared as he tucked them into his coat, said more than any speech could. He hadn't come for this. He hadn't asked for it. But it was his, and it was time. Jason watched as another officer approached with a folder. "Captain Mitchell," the officer announced, "your service record has been updated and your status changed from Kia to retired with honor. Your back pay will be issued with interest, and all veteran benefits reinstated effective immediately. Housing is available on any military base of your choosing, along with full medical access through the VA." Mitchell's response came as a quiet shake of the head. He stepped forward, glanced toward the assembled crowd, then looked directly at Colonel Rohr. "I don't want a house," he said, his voice calm but strong. "I don't need a title. I've had enough walls around me for one lifetime." Rohr blinked, caught off guard. "Then what would you like, sir?" Mitchell turned toward the flagpole in the center of the courtyard, its halyard rope swaying gently in the breeze. "I'd like permission to raise the flag each morning. Just that. Nothing more." The silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was reverence. Rohr hesitated, then looked at Hawthorne, who gave the slightest nod. Colonel Rohr straightened. "Permission granted. As long as this base stands, that flag is yours to raise." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Not applause, not cheering. Just a quiet agreement from every soldier present that they had just witnessed something important. As the ceremony concluded, soldiers moved forward, one by one, to shake Mitchell's hand. Some offered words of thanks. Others just nodded and walked away, their faces heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. Jason waited until the crowd thinned before stepping forward. "You did it," he said. "No," Mitchell replied, giving a half smile. "You did." Jason looked down at the folded papers in his hands. They were copies of the final confirmation from the Department of Defense. Official validation. The truth, once sealed in vaults and denied by silence, now printed in ink and stamped with recognition. "I guess you're not invisible anymore," Jason said. Mitchell glanced toward the flagpole again. "No one's invisible forever. Not if someone's willing to look." That evening, as the sun dipped below the Nevada hills, the base settled into its usual rhythm. But there was one new routine now etched into the soul of Fort Lincoln. Every morning, before reveille, the gate would open early, and a man in a canvas jacket would step through. He would walk with purpose to the base's flagpole, carrying a broom in one hand and the folded flag in the other. And when he raised it, the soldiers would watch, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. Because in that quiet act, they saw something more than duty. They saw endurance. They saw redemption. They saw the man who had never stopped serving, even when the world forgot him. Aaron Mitchell didn't need a podium or a statue or his name etched in gold. He had the flag. And now, the flag had him. The flagpole stood in the center of Fort Lincoln like a sentinel carved into stone, unmoved by time, unbent by the desert wind. But now, it had a keeper, Captain Aaron Mitchell. Every morning at 0600 sharp, before the bugle call echoed across the yard, he was there. The gates opened early for one man alone, and through them walked not a general, not a convoy, not a rank-and-file officer, but a quiet figure in a canvas jacket and worn boots, carrying the flag with reverent hands. The soldiers who once walked past him without notice now stepped aside, stood straighter, and watched in silence as he made his way toward the mast. No orders were ever issued for them to gather. No memos were sent. But they came anyway. At first it was just a few, Jason Miller, a couple of NCOs from logistics, and one chaplain in a weathered wool coat. Then came the younger recruits, followed by whole platoons whose commanding officers had paused their morning briefings to let them witness something more important than a classroom lesson. Within a week, the courtyard was no longer empty at sunrise. It was filled with soldiers of every rank and division, standing shoulder to shoulder, not to be seen, but to see. Aaron raised the flag with deliberate care. Each fold he released from the triangle held the memory of men he had buried in silence. Each motion, from securing the clips to pulling the halyard, was performed with unwavering precision. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the flag. And when it reached its peak and fluttered in the wind, he held his salute a little longer than regulation required. Not because he had forgotten protocol, but because this wasn't protocol to him. It was sacred. Jason stood near the front each morning, a quiet fixture in the gathering. The first time he had tried to help hoist the flag, Mitchell had gently placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "This part is mine." Jason had nodded and stepped back. He understood. Some rituals don't need assistance. They need memory. One morning, shortly after the ceremony, a staff sergeant approached Jason outside the mess hall. "That your guy?" he asked, gesturing toward Mitchell's retreating figure. Jason nodded. "Yes, sir." The sergeant shook his head slowly. "I read the report. Didn't believe it at first. Thought it was just another training legend." "He's real," Jason said. "And he was there." "Yeah," the sergeant replied. "And now he's here." That means something. It meant more than they knew. Word began to spread beyond Fort Lincoln. At first, just whispers through veteran groups and internal emails. Then came the phone calls from higher offices, and a quiet ripple through the Pentagon. A man thought lost in a covert operation had returned not with noise, but with humility. The Department of Defense issued a formal statement verifying Aaron Mitchell's identity, releasing select details of Operation Thunderline now decades old. They didn't glorify it. They couldn't. Too much had been hidden for too long. But they acknowledged him. Officially. Publicly. Veterans organizations responded almost immediately. One group flew in former members of Mitchell's old division. Another offered him honorary induction into a Hall of Valor in Arlington. Letters arrived daily, some typed, some handwritten, many from soldiers he had never met, thanking him for serving even when no one had seen. Mitchell read them all in the evenings, sitting by the window of his modest room off base, under a lamp that hummed quietly with age. He never replied. He didn't have to. The next morning, he raised the flag again. One day, a civilian car pulled up to the edge of the parade field. Out stepped a boy, maybe 9 or 10, clutching his father's hand. The man was a veteran too. Jason recognized the posture even in jeans and a flannel shirt. They stood at the back of the morning crowd and watched in silence as Mitchell performed his ritual. Afterward, the boy approached shyly, holding out a small patch from a toy uniform kit. "Sir," the boy said, eyes wide, "they said you were a real hero." Mitchell knelt slowly, knees stiff with age, and took the patch. He looked at it, then at the boy. "The real heroes are the ones we remember." The boy nodded solemnly. "I want to be like you someday." Mitchell handed the patch back. "Then remember this, honor is quiet. But it never quits." The boy saluted. It was crooked, clumsy. But Mitchell returned it with the same gravity he had once given generals. That moment would travel far. Photos were taken. Videos surfaced. News outlets requested interviews, feature stories, morning show appearances. Mitchell declined them all. He didn't want a spotlight. He had stood in darkness too long to care for stage lights now. His answer was always the same: if I wanted attention, I wouldn't have spent 40 years in silence. But even without a microphone, his presence spoke louder than headlines. Commanding officers began referencing his name during leadership briefings. Not as a footnote in a case study, but as a living example. Character, One major said during a commissioning ceremony, "Isn't built in front of a crowd. It's built in the shadows. Just ask Captain Mitchell." The new recruits, especially those from Silver Ridge Military Academy, took notice. They arrived in groups on weekends, standing respectfully at the back, some jotting notes, some simply watching. Eventually, the academy reached out to Fort Lincoln with a proposal. They wanted to establish a small facility on base, a leadership library that would house not just military doctrine but also personal journals, letters, and oral histories that focused on ethical service. They wanted to name it after him. The Aaron Mitchell Ethics Library was approved within a month. When they told him, Mitchell said only, "If it helps someone else stand for something, then it's worth it." Jason asked him one evening if it ever felt strange to be seen again after so long. Mitchell looked toward the horizon. "I never wanted to be forgotten," he said. "I just didn't want to be remembered for the wrong things." And so the days continued, one after another, always beginning the same way. With a flag raised by a man whose story had once been buried beneath ink and silence, now resurrected by truth, seen through reverence, and remembered not for how he returned, but for how he never stopped showing up. Recognition had finally come. Not through applause, but through legacy. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The mornings at Fort Lincoln began to feel different, not because the routine had changed, but because it suddenly meant something more. The base woke earlier now, not to the bark of drill sergeants or the hum of engines, but to the knowledge that a man had already arrived at the flagpole long before them. Aaron Mitchell, once a ghost in their periphery, had become the soul of the dawn. His presence reshaped the rhythm of life across the installation, not with command, not with orders, but with quiet, unwavering consistency. The cadence of his boots walking from the gate to the flagpole had become as familiar as the bugle's call. Each morning, soldiers lined the courtyard with silent anticipation. They didn't stand in formation. They weren't ordered to be there. Yet they came. Some brought their coffee, others their notebooks, a few in running gear, many still in fatigues. It wasn't about discipline anymore. It was about reverence. Watching Captain Mitchell raise the flag had become a kind of ritual, a grounding moment that reminded them of something older than regulation and deeper than duty. No two mornings were exactly alike. Some were painted in gold light with a breeze so soft it barely moved the halyard. Others arrived cloaked in fog or bristling with cold that stiffened hands and cheeks. But Aaron showed up all the same. He would arrive with the same calm gait, flag folded neatly under his arm, broom in his other hand. He would pause at the base of the pole, look up at the empty mast as if greeting a fallen friend, then begin the ceremony with a grace that made silence feel like a hymn. The process was always precise. He would snap the flag open gently, attaching the clips with hands steadied by time. Then he would lift it into the sky, one pull at a time, his eyes following every inch of red, white, and blue as it rose. When it reached the top, he held his salute until the last ripple of fabric settled into stillness. And when it was done, he'd return to sweeping, as if nothing remarkable had happened. But it had. And they all knew it. Children from the base housing had started to come. First it was a curious boy in pajamas, hand held by a groggy father in uniform. Then it was 3 siblings, coats buttoned and eyes wide, standing by the bench as if drawn by something they couldn't name. By the end of the month, there were nearly a dozen each day, wrapped in blankets, holding breakfast sandwiches, yawning through sleepy eyes but watching intently. They called him Mr. Mitchell, or sometimes Captain, depending on what their parents had told them. He greeted each with a nod and a soft smile, never breaking his rhythm. When they asked questions, he answered simply. "Why do you stand so still, sir?" "Because the flag deserves it." "Were you really in a war?" "I was. I still am." "Do you miss your team?" "Every day." One morning, a small girl with pigtails brought him a drawing. It was a stick figure standing by a flag, surrounded by stars. At the bottom she had written, "Thank you for not stopping." Mitchell studied it for a long time, then folded it and placed it inside his coat beside the photograph he still carried, the one of his team from Operation Thunderline. The chaplain began attending the ceremonies regularly, sometimes offering a prayer afterward, sometimes standing in silence like the rest. He confided in Jason once, "I've given sermons to full pews that didn't move people the way that man does just by raising a flag." Jason believed it. Every soldier on the base had started adjusting their schedule so they could catch the ritual. Officers signed off on minor delays. Recruits volunteered for extra early chow duty so they could be released in time. Entire units shifted their run times to pass by the flagpole just as Mitchell lowered his hand from the final salute. No one complained. No one had to explain. They simply knew. At the Pentagon, word of Mitchell's mornings reached higher circles. A general visiting from D.C. came to witness it for himself. He arrived unannounced, wearing civilian clothes, and stood among the crowd at the back. When the ceremony ended, he waited until Mitchell finished sweeping and approached with quiet footsteps. "Captain," he said, offering his hand, "you don't know me, but I know of you. I've read your file. I came to see if it was real." Mitchell took his hand and looked him in the eye. "I never left." The general nodded, visibly moved. "No, sir. You didn't." Back on base, Mitchell's influence continued to spread. Training officers began referencing him in leadership lectures. Not as a relic, not as a curiosity, but as a standard. His name became shorthand for integrity. "We need Mitchell energy," one drill sergeant told his platoon when morale dipped. The phrase caught on. Even the youngest cadets knew who he was now. During visiting weekends, they lined up for a chance to meet him, not to get autographs or photos, but to ask questions, to shake his hand, to witness something real. Many said it was the first time they truly understood what military service meant, not from manuals, not from history books, but from a man with a broom who saluted a flag with tears he never let fall. When asked by one curious cadet why he still swept the sidewalk every day, Mitchell replied, "Because some things need to be clean. Not just the ground, but the memory. The silence. The space between footsteps." Jason often joined him afterward, helping pick up stray wrappers, sometimes saying nothing, sometimes asking questions. One day he asked the question that had been growing in him since this all began. "Do you think it was worth it, sir? The silence? The waiting?" Mitchell didn't answer right away. He looked up at the flag, then back down at the path he had just cleaned. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes the most important service doesn't end with a discharge. It just changes shape." And then he swept one more line across the walkway, smooth and deliberate, before turning back toward the bench where the children waited to say good morning. The footsteps that followed him now were not echoes of the past. They were echoes of legacy. Of lives touched not by speeches or medals, but by presence. By steadiness. By the simple act of showing up every single day. And so, the flag kept rising. And Aaron Mitchell kept walking. The construction began quietly, like most important things do. There were no bulldozers or ribbon cuttings, no photo ops or press releases. Just a team of engineers, some donated lumber, and a portable trailer that was cleared and repurposed by volunteers from the base maintenance crew. The space measured no more than 40 feet long and 15 feet wide, but it would become something far larger than its walls. At its center was a simple wooden plaque, carved with care and lacquered in clear varnish, bearing 7 words that would define its mission: the Aaron Mitchell Ethics Library, for those who serve in silence. It had been Jason's idea, though he never claimed credit. After a conversation with the command chaplain and an academy instructor from Silver Ridge, he had submitted a proposal, never expecting it to go anywhere. But within a week, signatures were being added, resources shifted, and plans drawn up. The command structure didn't just approve it, they accelerated it. Within a month, the trailer was fully converted into a space that didn't just teach leadership, but reverence. The first thing placed inside wasn't a book. It was the photo. The one Mitchell carried close to his heart for over 40 years. The one with the 8 men in uniform, standing before a burning helicopter, faces smeared with ash and resolve. The photo sat in a glass case near the entrance, beside a set of dog tags recovered during the restoration of Mitchell's file. Next to it, a small brass plaque read, Captain Aaron Mitchell, Operation Thunderline. Presumed Kia, 1977. Return to duty, 2025. The books came next. Not manuals, not tactics, but stories. Letters from veterans. Essays on honor and humility. Accounts of difficult decisions made far from cameras and parades. The collection wasn't about teaching how to command. It was about why to serve. The chaplain donated a leather-bound journal written by a medic who had tended to dying soldiers in the mountains of Afghanistan. A retired lieutenant colonel sent in transcripts of battlefield conversations that shaped his moral compass more than any doctrine ever could. Each artifact, each page, was chosen for one purpose, to remind every young soldier who entered that ethics was not a code in a binder, it was a life lived when no one was watching. Mitchell never asked to be involved. In fact, when Jason told him about the idea, he had stared at the dirt for a long time before replying, "You don't need my name on anything." But when the trailer was finished and the doors first opened, he showed up. Quietly. He walked through it without ceremony, his hands folded behind his back, eyes drifting from book spines to framed letters. At the far end of the room was a single wooden chair, placed beneath a window that looked out toward the flagpole. Mitchell sat in it and said nothing for almost an hour. The first official group to visit came from Silver Ridge Military Academy. Cadets filed and dressed in navy coats and polished boots, notebooks in hand, but it wasn't long before they stopped writing and started simply watching. Mitchell was there that morning, seated again beneath the window. One cadet asked him what the hardest decision he ever made was. Mitchell answered without hesitation. Staying. The cadet looked confused. Staying behind? No, Mitchell said softly. Staying alive when I thought I didn't deserve to. The words hung in the room like incense, wrapping around every mind present. The chaplain later said it was the best ethics lecture he'd ever heard, and it had only been 8 words. The library quickly became a requirement for officer candidates preparing for commissioning. Before they received their pins, they had to sit in that space, read at least 2 entries, and write a reflection on what service meant beyond the uniform. Some walked in expecting a formality. They walked out quieter, more grounded. Some left with tears they tried to hide. None left unchanged. Jason took over as part-time coordinator, arranging visits, maintaining the books, and cataloging new additions. He called it a second duty, though he admitted it felt more like a calling. Each week, he asked Mitchell if there was anything else he wanted to add. Mitchell always said no. But one afternoon, he arrived with a folded piece of cloth, an old armband with frayed edges and a faded insignia from a mission long buried. He handed it to Jason. Put it near the letters, he said. It belonged to the one who didn't make it out. Jason placed it in a display case beside a letter written by a corporal who had died in Baghdad. The letter ended with the line, "Even if I don't make it back, tell my daughter I didn't stop believing in why I went." That line, combined with the armband, became the heart of the room. It was where most cadets lingered the longest. Word spread beyond the military. University students from nearby colleges began requesting permission to visit. A handful of history professors reached out, offering to collaborate on a civilian version of the library's materials. A retired judge from Las Vegas donated a collection of essays on moral courage, saying, "Captain Mitchell reminds us that sometimes the right thing isn't the loud thing, it's the steady thing." But to Mitchell, it wasn't about recognition. He still swept the sidewalk each morning. He still raised the flag at 0600 sharp. He still walked home alone after lunch, head low, hands in his pockets. The only difference now was that others followed. Children still came, now bringing friends. Soldiers still saluted, even when he wasn't looking. Cadets still lined up with notebooks and nervous questions. But Mitchell remained the same. A man anchored not by past glory, but by present purpose. The ethics library became more than a building. It became a mirror. And each visitor saw something different reflected back, an echo of their own duty, a reminder of what honor looks like when stripped of rank, medals, and applause. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the barracks and the flag fluttered in soft gold light, Jason sat beside Mitchell outside the trailer. "Did you ever think your story would become this?" Mitchell shook his head. "My story was never the point. The silence was." Jason glanced toward the door, where cadets still trickled in, their eyes wide, their steps quiet. "You broke the silence," Jason said. Mitchell looked out toward the flag and replied, "No. I just let it speak." And in that soft stillness between them, with the last light warming the earth, it was clear that the library hadn't been built to preserve history. It had been built to protect what history too often forgets. Character. Quiet. And the courage to keep showing up. The policy didn't begin with a press conference or a televised speech. It began in a quiet office in the Pentagon, where General Richard Hawthorne stood alone in front of a window, gazing out over the Capitol with the same hollow stare he'd once worn in the jungle. In his hand was a photograph, 8 men, caked in ash and grit, standing in front of a smoking helicopter. 7 of them had returned. 1 had disappeared. And for 40 years, that one had been forgotten not by accident, but by design. That photograph was now the catalyst for something the military had resisted for decades, admitting that its own system, built on precision and accountability, had failed someone it swore to never leave behind. The Mitchell Protocol began as a draft proposal handwritten on legal pad paper. Hawthorne wrote it late one night after returning from Fort Lincoln, unable to sleep, the image of Aaron standing at the flagpole haunting him like a sacred obligation. The proposal wasn't dramatic. It didn't demand sweeping reforms or point fingers. It simply asked a question that no one had dared to put in ink until now: what happens when we presume a man is dead, and he isn't? That question, and the quiet man who embodied it, became the heartbeat of a policy destined to change how the military treated the invisible. The draft circulated quietly among trusted colleagues. Senior officers read it and passed it along, each adding their endorsement with unexpected speed. By the time it reached the Secretary of the Army's desk, it was no longer a whisper, it was a movement. Within 3 weeks, a task force had been formed. Its objective was simple: to build an operational framework that would ensure what happened to Captain Aaron Mitchell would never happen again. The Mitchell Protocol was written with the clarity of someone who had witnessed loss not once, but twice, the first time in combat, the second in silence. It mandated a series of procedures that seemed so obvious in hindsight they were almost painful to write. The first pillar required enhanced follow-ups on soldiers listed as missing in action, particularly those involved in classified operations. Reports could no longer be closed without a secondary verification process, one that involved independent review and psychological analysis of survivor accounts. The second pillar addressed identity. Covert operatives and special recon units would be equipped with multi-layered identification systems, including biometric data stored securely off-grid and retrievable even in cases of tag destruction or capture. No longer would a soldier's life be erased because a nameplate was lost in mud or fire. The third pillar redefined veteran reintegration protocols. Hospitals and VA centers were instructed to establish cross-branch alerts for any patient showing signs of military service without matching identification. If a man arrived broken, nameless, and silent, the system would no longer treat him as a footnote. It would ask the question: what if he came home and no one was looking for him anymore? The fourth pillar placed responsibility directly on the shoulders of commanders. They were now accountable not just for the deployment and return of their troops, but for the long tail of their aftermath. A new requirement was added to the field debriefing curriculum: when one of yours goes missing, you don't write him off. You remember. You follow up. And if he walks through your gates again, you recognize him. Jason read the full protocol late one night in the staff break room at Fort Lincoln. The digital document had been forwarded to all command-level personnel, but someone had printed a copy and left it on the table beside a half-eaten sandwich and an empty cup of coffee. He sat alone, the base quiet around him, the overhead light flickering with age. As he read, his throat tightened. The words weren't just lines in a memo. They were sentences that had grown out of footsteps he'd followed for months. They were policy born from presence. The next morning, Jason found Mitchell already at the flagpole, the rope in one hand, the folded flag in the other. He stood silently as always, the breeze tugging at the hem of his jacket, the light catching the silver in his beard. Jason walked up beside him, holding the printed packet. "They named it after you," he said. Mitchell didn't look away from the flag. "Named what?" "A protocol. A whole new policy. It's going to change how the military handles MIA cases. How they track soldiers. How they bring them home." Mitchell stayed quiet. Jason handed him the packet. He took it slowly, scanning the title page. The Mitchell Protocol. He flipped through the first few pages without comment, eyes moving steadily over each paragraph. When he reached the end, he closed the packet and handed it back. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "I know," Jason replied. "But you earned it." Mitchell exhaled. "It's not for me." "No," Jason agreed. "It's for the ones who haven't come home yet." Later that week, the protocol was signed into policy in a quiet ceremony held in a Pentagon conference room. No cameras, no reporters. Just a handful of senior officers, a folded flag at the front, and a framed photograph of Aaron Mitchell placed on the table beside the final draft. General Hawthorne delivered the only words spoken aloud: "This isn't about rewriting history. It's about preventing it from vanishing again." Back at Fort Lincoln, the soldiers didn't talk much about the protocol. They didn't have to. They saw it every morning in the man who raised the flag. It wasn't a document to them. It was a person. A story made real. A truth they could salute. The ethics library placed a copy of the protocol in a glass case near the entrance, beside the armband and the letter from the fallen corporal. On the wall above it, someone had stenciled a quote, attributed to Aaron Mitchell, though he never remembered saying it. "You don't save a man once. You keep saving him until someone else remembers who he was." And now, because of that memory, soldiers would be remembered not just in battle, but in silence, in absence, in the years they might be lost, and in the moment they found their way back. The Mitchell Protocol was not just a reform. It was a promise. And every morning, with a flag raised by a man who had never truly left his post, that promise was kept. It was just past dawn when the black SUV rolled through the eastern gate of Fort Lincoln. No fanfare, no sirens. Just tinted windows and a single government plate that bore no insignia except a small Department of Defense sticker on the windshield. The guards at the checkpoint snapped to attention as the driver flashed credentials. No one knew who the passenger was, not yet. But word traveled fast on military soil, especially when the vehicle didn't stop at headquarters or the officer's compound. Instead, it made a slow, deliberate turn toward the courtyard near the flagpole, where Aaron Mitchell was already beginning his daily ritual. The fog was thick that morning, resting low like smoke across the pavement. A few dozen soldiers had gathered as usual. Some stood with coffee in hand, some with hands behind their backs, some with arms loosely crossed in front of them. They had no orders to be there. They simply came, drawn by the weight of something they didn't want to admit they needed. A sense of grounding. Of continuity. Aaron stood where he always did, broom laid aside, the flag tucked beneath his arm, eyes scanning the halyard with the same reverence he had shown on the battlefield. He didn't see the SUV arrive. He didn't notice the tall figure in full dress uniform stepping out from the passenger side. Not until the general stepped forward, boots echoing softly against the concrete. Jason saw him first. His breath caught as he recognized the 4 stars on the epaulette, the polished shoes, the ribbons lined across the chest in precise rows. This was General Elias Langston, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The highest-ranking military officer in the United States Armed Forces. He was known for being measured, brilliant, and fiercely protective of the institution he served. His presence at Fort Lincoln was not routine. It was history unfolding. The soldiers turned as they noticed him, posture stiffening instinctively. But Langston didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed on the man by the flagpole, who had just attached the clips to the flag and was preparing to raise it. Mitchell hadn't moved. Hadn't acknowledged the new arrival. His focus was unbroken, even as the fog began to thin and the stars on the general's shoulders shimmered in the rising light. And then it happened. Just as Mitchell pulled the halyard, lifting the flag from the earth with slow precision, General Langston came to attention. He raised his right hand and delivered a full, formal salute. Not a nod. Not a gesture of respect. A textbook, regulation salute, held perfectly as the flag ascended into the sky. The soldiers froze. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if time itself had paused to witness it. Aaron felt it before he saw it. The weight of decades. Of command. Of recognition long denied. He turned his head slightly and saw Langston standing alone, hand raised, eyes steady. And in that moment, the world bent in reverence to a man it had once forgotten. Aaron lowered his hand slowly. The flag reached the top of the pole, fluttering with quiet authority. He held his gaze on Langston. Their eyes locked. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to explain. Langston stepped forward, his hand now extended. Aaron looked at it, then at the man behind it, and finally took it in his own. Their hands met with the silent weight of everything that had gone unsaid for 40 years. I came, Langston said, voice low but firm, because we owe you far more than words. Aaron nodded once. I didn't ask for this. No, Langston replied. But you gave everything anyway. Behind them, the crowd had swelled. Not just soldiers now, but civilians from the base housing, cadets from Silver Ridge, children holding small American flags. Word had spread through text messages and whispers. Something sacred was happening at the flagpole. And they came. Langston turned and addressed the gathering, his voice clear and steady. This man stood watch when we forgot he existed. He served without command. He endured without praise. And he did so with a quiet strength that this nation must never again overlook. Captain Aaron Mitchell's return is not just the return of a soldier. It is the restoration of a sacred trust. He paused, letting the silence speak. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Langston reached into his coat and withdrew a velvet case. Inside was a medal, gleaming beneath the morning sun. The Medal for Valor in Continued Service, he announced. A new recognition, established today. It exists because of him. And it begins with him. Jason's heart slammed in his chest. Around him, he saw tears on faces that hadn't wept in years. Hardened veterans. New recruits. Mothers. Chaplains. Even Colonel Shaw stood at the back, his hand resting firmly over his heart. Aaron looked down at the case. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he looked at the flag, then back at the crowd, then back to Langston. This, he said quietly, belongs to every man who never got to come home. I only kept sweeping for them. Langston placed the medal in his hands anyway. Then let this be for them. And for you. Because you never left your post. There was no applause. Just silence. And then, as if on cue, someone in the crowd began to sing. Softly. A familiar tune. Oh say, can you see, and then others joined in. One by one. Until the national anthem rose like a wave across the courtyard, full and trembling, sung not out of ceremony, but out of truth. Out of gratitude. Out of reverence. Aaron stood still, eyes on the flag, the medal in his hand. The song swelled around him, carrying decades of forgotten honor, of lonely mornings, of silent sacrifice. When the final note faded into the wind, Langston whispered something only Jason could hear. Sometimes history doesn't need to be written. It just needs to be witnessed. And that morning, it was. The letter arrived without ceremony, folded into a plain white envelope with no return address. The handwriting was neat, careful, the kind of script taught long before texting replaced penmanship. Aaron Mitchell found it in his mailbox on a Tuesday morning just after he returned from raising the flag. He held it in his hands longer than usual, sensing something about it that pulled at a deeper place than routine. He opened it slowly, unfolded the paper, and began to read. Dear Aaron, I don't know if you remember me. My name is Thomas Rankin. We served together in '77. You were my captain. You told me to keep low behind that rock, and because of that, I'm alive today. I've thought about you for 40 years. Thought you were gone. Mourned you. Cursed God. Now I hear you're alive. That you came home. I don't know what to say. I just need to see you. If you'll let me. Aaron's breath caught in his throat. The name brought back a face, young, scared, bleeding from the ear but still crawling toward his position that day in the jungle. Thomas Rankin had barely been 20. Mitchell hadn't thought of him in years. He sat down on the bench outside his cabin and read the letter again, every word carving away the silence he had kept inside himself for so long. It was more than a message. It was a resurrection of memory. 2 days later, Rankin arrived. The man who stepped off the bus was older now, of course. Gray in the beard, a limp in his right leg, eyes that had seen too much and tried to forget more. He wore a windbreaker zipped to the neck and carried a duffel bag that sagged with weight. Aaron stood at the gate when he arrived, as still as ever, watching the man approach. Rankin stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to reach for a handshake or simply stare. I thought you were a ghost, he said. I was, Aaron replied. For a long time. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They simply walked side by side, past the flagpole, past the chapel, past the officers' quarters that neither of them had lived in for decades. Rankin glanced around, nodding softly. Base looks different, he murmured. So do we. Aaron led him to the ethics library. Rankin walked through it slowly, pausing at the photo near the entrance. His hand trembled as he reached out to touch the glass. You still got this? Someone kept it, Aaron said. Long enough to remember. Rankin walked to the far wall, where a letter from a fallen corporal was framed in the corner. His eyes narrowed. That's Morales, he whispered. He was on your team, wasn't he? Aaron nodded. He didn't make it out. Rankin lowered his head. We lost more than blood back there, didn't we? We lost silence, Aaron said. And when I came back, I didn't know how to speak it anymore. They sat together on the bench outside as the sun began to rise higher. Rankin pulled out a worn envelope from his jacket and handed it to Aaron. It's from my wife, he said. She passed 2 years ago. But before she died, she made me promise to find a way to forgive. She didn't say who or what. Just, forgive. Aaron opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph of Rankin and a woman smiling at a 4th of July picnic, a child on her lap and sparklers in her hand. On the back, in delicate cursive, were 4 words, Forgive the silence, Thomas. Aaron stared at it for a long time. I used to think silence was survival, he said finally. Now I know it's a wound. Rankin turned toward him. Do you regret it? Staying in the shadows all these years. Aaron thought about the long nights, the sweeping, the waiting, the quiet mornings where the world didn't look his way. And then he thought of the flagpole, the cadets, the children, the protocol named in his honor, and this moment now, sitting beside a man he once saved, who had come back to help him heal. "No," he said. "I regret not believing someone would ever come looking." Rankin swallowed hard. "I should have come sooner. I didn't know you needed us." "I didn't need everyone," Aaron replied, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "I just needed someone." That night, they sat around a fire pit behind the chapel, a few other veterans joining them as the stars blinked above. Stories were shared, old songs hummed, laughter cracked open like old books being reread. Rankin told them about his wife, his son, his years in construction, his struggle with nightmares. Aaron listened, offering nods and the occasional low chuckle, never pushing, only receiving. When Rankin rose to leave the next morning, Aaron walked him to the bus. They stood for a moment, not as officer and soldier, but as men who had crossed the same darkness and returned from it differently. "Don't disappear again," Rankin said. Aaron managed a smile. "I'm here every morning. Come see the flag sometime." Rankin boarded the bus, and Aaron stood at attention until it was gone. Back at the base, Jason found Aaron sweeping the sidewalk as usual. He stopped and watched him for a moment before speaking. "You okay?" Aaron leaned on the broom and looked up. "Someone from the past came looking," he said. Jason raised an eyebrow. "And?" Aaron smiled faintly. "Turns out the past isn't a place you run from. Sometimes it's the one thing you need to be whole." And with that, he returned to his sweeping, the morning wind carrying away the last pieces of silence he'd held for far too long. The morning started like any other. Aaron Mitchell swept the sidewalk around the flagpole as the first rays of sunlight cut through the trees. He moved with familiar rhythm, broom gliding left to right, pausing only when the wind scattered leaves too fast to chase. The sky was pale blue, the air cool. There was nothing extraordinary about this morning. Until the hum of engines broke the stillness. He looked up. Rows of military transport trucks slowly rolled through the eastern gate, one after another in a column that stretched down the road. Behind them came Humvees, a military band bus, and then a long flatbed trailer bearing something covered in white cloth. Soldiers began gathering by the curb, eyes wide with confusion. No one had ordered a parade. There had been no announcements, no preparations. And yet, here it was. Jason sprinted toward him from across the quad, breathless, his face flushed with excitement. "You didn't hear?" Aaron shook his head, the broom still in his hand. "What is this?" Jason grinned. "It's for you." The flatbed came to a stop in the courtyard. The cloth was pulled back, revealing a life-sized bronze statue, an exact likeness of Aaron Mitchell, standing tall in uniform, hand raised in salute beside a flagpole cast in gleaming steel. The statue wasn't stoic. It was alive in its stillness, eyes looking slightly upward, posture firm, grounded. Beneath it, engraved in gold, were the words, "Captain Aaron Mitchell, he never left his post." Aaron stood frozen. For a man who had carried silence like armor, this moment pierced every layer. He hadn't asked for any of this. But it had come, like a wave that couldn't be held back any longer. The crowd thickened. Families from base housing emerged with their children, cadets in uniform stood shoulder to shoulder, officers lined the sidewalks. Across the campus, bells began to toll, clear and solemn, and then the band struck a low, reverent chord. Drums rumbled. Brass shimmered in the light. And then the melody began, "America the Beautiful," played not with pomp, but with soul. From the center of the crowd, General Langston appeared once more. This time, he did not speak from a podium. He walked slowly to Aaron, placed a hand on his shoulder, and gestured toward the crowd. "Captain Mitchell," he said, "you once told me that showing up wasn't for applause. But today, the country needs to say something. We need to say thank you. Not because you raised a flag. But because you reminded us what the flag stands for. Aaron's throat tightened. He glanced around, overwhelmed by faces, young and old, military and civilian, each watching him with something deeper than admiration. It was gratitude. It was reverence. And perhaps, most moving of all, it was recognition. The band quieted. Langston stepped aside. And then a voice rose up from the back of the crowd. A boy's voice. Clear. High. Unafraid. Captain Mitchell, sir. Aaron turned toward the sound. A child stood at the front of a group of schoolchildren, hand raised in salute. You're my hero. A ripple of warmth spread through the crowd. Aaron blinked, looking down at the boy. Then, slowly, he returned the salute. The boy's eyes lit up. And then, one by one, others followed. Children. Cadets. Soldiers. Veterans. Salutes rose across the courtyard, not from command but from conviction. It was spontaneous. Pure. A tribute no ceremony could have scripted. Aaron looked at the statue again. It wasn't just a likeness. It was a legacy, cast not in metal, but in memory. He stepped toward it, hand brushing the edge of the engraved base. Then he turned and addressed the crowd, his voice steady despite the emotion welling inside. I didn't come here for a monument, he said. I came here because something inside me couldn't let go. I raised the flag each morning not for recognition, but because I had to believe someone still cared. That duty wasn't just a word in our oaths, it was the thing that kept us alive, even when the world moved on. He looked at the children, at the soldiers who had gathered. Today, you've made me believe again. Not in medals. Not in titles. But in all of you. In what we still are, when we choose to remember. There was a long silence after he finished. Then, as if the entire base had rehearsed it, the crowd began to applaud. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't rushed. It was steady. Rhythmic. Like the sound of boots marching home. Later that day, when the sun dipped low and the statue cast a long shadow across the quad, Aaron returned alone. He stood in front of the bronze version of himself and looked up quietly. Then, without a word, he swept the sidewalk around it, just as he had every morning for years. It was never about the ceremony. It was about the watch. And he was still keeping it. The autumn sun dipped lower each day, casting longer shadows over Fort Lincoln's courtyard. Leaves turned amber and crimson, swirling in the wind that whispered like memories through the branches. Aaron Mitchell kept to his daily routine, broom in hand at dawn, flag raised with reverence, and quiet conversations with those who sought him out. But this morning felt different. The air was heavier somehow, as if something unsaid hovered nearby. Jason approached him just after the flag reached its peak. His face was tight with concern. Cadet Ramirez asked to see you, Jason said. Aaron turned slightly. Ramirez? Jason nodded. First year. Sharp, but, something's been eating at him. Aaron wiped his hands on his pants and nodded once. Send him over. Minutes later, a young man in crisp cadet uniform approached, his steps hesitant but deliberate. He stopped a few feet away and stood stiffly at attention. Sir. Cadet First Class Julian Ramirez reporting as requested. At ease, Cadet, Aaron said gently. And lose the formality. I'm not your CO. Ramirez shifted awkwardly. Yes, sir, yes. Aaron gestured to the bench near the flagpole. Let's sit. They sat in silence for a long moment. The only sounds were distant footfalls and the occasional call of a drill sergeant echoing from the training field. Ramirez finally broke the silence. Sir, I came to say something. Something I should have said a long time ago. Or maybe I don't deserve to say it at all. Aaron studied the young man's trembling hands, the sweat beading on his forehead despite the crisp air. I joined this place because my brother served, Ramirez began. He was in the same unit you were in, back in '77. His name was Marco. Aaron's eyes sharpened. Marco Ramirez. Point man. Quick on his feet. Always humming something under his breath. Ramirez nodded quickly. That was him. You remember. I remember all of them, Aaron said softly. My family, we thought you were dead, Ramirez continued, voice cracking. Everyone did. And when they started talking about the Mitchell Protocol, and then I found out you were alive, I couldn't believe it. I thought maybe the army was just using your story for PR. Aaron didn't respond. He let the young man speak. So I did something, Ramirez confessed. I went to the records office. I pulled old files. Reports. Eyewitness accounts. I wanted to prove it. That you weren't some myth. That you were real. And did you? Aaron asked. Ramirez's face flushed with guilt. Yes. But I also found something else. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin folder, weathered and marked with old security codes. He placed it on Aaron's lap. It's a letter, he whispered. From my brother. Dated 4 days before the mission went sideways. He wrote it in case he didn't make it. My family never got it. It was buried in the records. I think someone didn't want it to be found. Aaron opened the folder and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Marco's tone came back to him instantly, wry, hopeful, and always trying to reassure those around him. In the letter, Marco wrote about the mission, about doubts he had regarding its timing, and about the man leading it. Captain Mitchell is the reason I haven't gone crazy out here. He's the only one who keeps his head when everything else is on fire. If I don't make it back, tell my family I died with someone worth following. Aaron stared at the words until they blurred. My brother believed in you, Ramirez said. And I needed to know if I could, too. Aaron looked up at the cadet, his voice quiet but steady. And now? Ramirez's shoulders sagged. Now I realize I was looking for someone to blame for what happened to my brother. I thought maybe you made a mistake, maybe you left him behind. But now I know, he followed you because he believed you'd never quit on anyone. Aaron folded the letter carefully and returned it to the folder. I didn't save him, Aaron said, almost to himself. I tried. God knows I tried. But he was gone before I could reach him. Ramirez shook his head. You saved what he believed in. That's more than I can say for most. They sat in silence again, but this time it was not heavy. It was shared. A weight lifted, if only slightly. You'll be a good officer, Aaron finally said. Not because of your rank. But because you asked the hard questions. Ramirez looked up, eyes glassy. Do you forgive me? Aaron offered a faint smile. You don't need my forgiveness. You need to remember your brother the way he wanted to be remembered. And carry that forward. As Ramirez stood, Aaron added, come back tomorrow. Bring your class. I want them to hear about the real Marco. Yes, sir, Ramirez said, standing at attention once more. I'd be honored. As the cadet walked away, Aaron leaned back on the bench and looked up at the flag. The wind caught it just right, and for a moment, it seemed to bow slightly, almost as if it, too, remembered the voice that used to hum beneath it, the one who marched in rhythm with hope. Aaron closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the past had not come back to haunt him. It had come back to heal. It started with a knock on the chapel door just before sunrise. Chaplain Moore, a kind-faced woman with salt and pepper hair and an instinct for sensing when something sacred hovered near, found Aaron Mitchell standing outside with a folded paper in his hand. She opened the door, surprised but unsurprised. Aaron never came to ask for things. When he did, it meant something mattered. Without speaking, he handed her the paper. She read it slowly, her eyes softening with every line. Then she looked at him and said, "It's time." By mid-morning, word had spread that something special would be unveiled inside the chapel's west wing. Soldiers came in their dress uniforms, cadets in polished boots, civilian families holding small children by the hand. Jason helped coordinate the setup, guiding a team of volunteers as they arranged chairs, polished the floor, and set a velvet cloth over the brass plaque that now hung on the west wall. Above it, carved in smooth oak, were the words, "The Hall of Honor, in memory of those who served without applause." At precisely 11 o'clock, the bell in the tower tolled once, and the doors opened. Aaron stood at the entrance, his hands folded behind him. He nodded to each person who passed, accepting their presence like one might accept a long-overdue apology. The last to enter was General Langston, who took his seat quietly, removing his hat and bowing his head. When the chapel settled into stillness, Chaplain Moore approached the podium. "There are stories that history forgets," she began, "not because they weren't true, but because they were quiet. And there are men and women whose service didn't end with a flight home or a medal pinned to the chest. Today, we honor one of those stories, and the legacy that will now live here forever." She stepped aside, and Aaron approached the plaque. With one tug, the velvet cloth fell, revealing a gleaming bronze relief, a sculpture of a soldier standing at a flagpole, broom in one hand, flag in the other. The likeness was unmistakable. It was him, but not just him. The face was humble, weathered, timeless. Etched into the base were names. Not ranks. Not dates. Just names, those of every soldier who had served with Aaron in 1977 and hadn't come home. Gasps rippled through the room. Several names sparked tears. Others brought proud smiles. Families recognized their fathers, brothers, sons. For some, it was the first time their loved ones had been formally remembered in any public way. Aaron turned to the audience. "I didn't know what to say today," he admitted. "For most of my life, I've kept quiet because I thought the world had forgotten men like us. But these names, they're not just mine to remember. They're yours, too." He stepped back, allowing silence to rest over the crowd like a prayer. General Langston rose, walking slowly to the front. He looked at the plaque, then turned to face the room. "This," he said, voice firm, "is what the Hall of Honor means. Not just remembering service, but restoring dignity. Not just honoring the famous, but elevating the faithful." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. Aaron Mitchell did not ask for this. He did not request this wall, this room, or even this recognition. But precisely because he didn't, because he kept showing up, even when no one was looking, he reminded us of the kind of courage that holds a nation together when the lights are off. Aaron lowered his gaze. It was difficult hearing such things out loud. Not because they weren't true, but because he had buried them for so long. After the ceremony, people lined up to approach the plaque. Some placed their hands gently on the names. Others knelt. One woman brought a faded photograph and tucked it into the edge of the frame, whispering the name of her brother. Aaron stood nearby, greeting each person, offering a quiet word, a hand on the shoulder, sometimes just a nod. His presence alone was enough. Jason eventually made his way through the crowd to his side. "You did something good today," he said. Aaron smiled faintly. "It wasn't just me. It was all of them." Jason looked around. Still, they needed someone to lift the veil. "You did that." Aaron looked back at the plaque. "I just swept the dust away." Later, when the crowd had thinned and the chapel returned to its usual hush, Aaron stood alone in front of the wall. The light from the stained glass windows cast colors across the names, making them shimmer like embers. He reached out, letting his fingers trace one name in particular, Corporal Nathaniel Banks. His best friend. The man who had once told him, "If I don't come home, you better raise that flag for me every day." And he had. As he turned to leave, he found Chaplain Moore waiting at the doorway. "I thought maybe you'd want this," she said, handing him a small leather-bound book. Aaron opened it. Inside were handwritten notes, stories submitted by families of the soldiers named on the wall. Anecdotes, letters, childhood memories, poems. It was a living archive. "They asked if you'd help read them aloud each week," Moore said. "One by one. So they're not just names." Aaron held the book close to his chest. "Yes," he said. "Every week. The Hall of Honor would remain open day and night from that moment on. Lights would never dim. And every Sunday at dawn, before the flag was raised, Aaron would sit beneath that plaque and read one name, one story, to anyone who would listen. Sometimes the pews would be full. Sometimes it would be just him and the wind. But he would keep reading. Because the world was finally listening. And silence had finally become a voice. The frost had crept in overnight, dusting the chapel's shingles and the sidewalks in a thin veil of white. Aaron Mitchell woke before the sun, as he always did, brewed a small cup of black coffee, and stepped into the stillness of dawn. The base lay quiet beneath a navy-blue sky on the edge of light. He moved with deliberate calm, every step familiar. Today was a special day, though no one had said it aloud. It was the final Sunday of the year, the day the Hall of Honor held its closing reading before the winter recess. Aaron had chosen the last name weeks ago. A name he'd carried in his heart since 1977. As he approached the chapel, he saw the chairs had already been set up, a few candles flickering by the stained glass window. Jason was there, kneeling beside the podium, checking the microphone. When he saw Aaron, he stood, offered a salute, and smiled. "They're all coming," he said quietly. "Even the top brass. You ready?" Aaron nodded. "I've been ready for 40 years. Within an hour, the pews were filled. Veterans from across the country had come, some in dress blues, others in faded caps and leather jackets adorned with patches and medals. Families, young cadets, widows, children holding portraits of fathers they'd never met. Every face turned as Aaron took his place at the front, the little black book in his hand. He opened it, fingers steady. Then he looked at the audience and spoke. "Today, I read the name of the last man I saw before everything went dark. The one who pulled me out of the fire, but didn't come with me through it. His name was Sergeant Elijah Vaughn. He taught me how to march, how to listen, and how to stand my ground. He told me if we ever got separated, I'd have to become the kind of man worth being remembered. I've spent my life trying to live up to that." He paused. A long breath passed between speaker and silence. Elijah died saving others. His body was never recovered. His name never made it into the newspapers. But today, his story is told. And it will live here, among others who stood tall without asking for attention. And if you remember nothing else, remember this: some of the greatest soldiers we've ever had were never given a parade. They just kept showing up. He closed the book. The silence that followed was not empty. It was reverent. Then came the moment no one expected. From the back of the chapel, a tall figure stepped forward, decorated with stars across both shoulders. Four-star General Howard Steele, recently appointed chairman of the Joint Chiefs, walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted without instruction. He reached the podium, turned to Aaron, and did something that stole the breath from the room. He saluted first. Aaron blinked, stunned. General Steele held the salute with unwavering pride, and when Aaron returned it, the general lowered his hand, stepped forward, and said, loud enough for all to hear, "Captain Aaron Mitchell, sir." A hush fell so deep that even the candles seemed to still. "You have given this nation more than any uniform ever asked," the general continued. "You served when no one was watching. You carried the flag when no one asked you to. You reminded us that honor isn't found in headlines, it's found in humility. And today, I kneel in thanks. He dropped to one knee. The audience gasped. A general, a man who commanded fleets and decisions of war, had knelt before a janitor, a forgotten captain who had never asked for anything more than a broom and a flag to raise. One by one, others followed. Veterans in wheelchairs raised trembling salutes. Cadets stood straighter. Families wept. And at the front, Aaron Mitchell stood with eyes glistening, shoulders square, heart full of the weight of a moment that broke every silence he'd ever carried. Later that day, the statue outside the chapel was polished with new care. Children ran around it, pointing at the flag it held. A small plaque was added at the base, beneath his name. It read, "The man who stood watch when no one knew they needed him." As evening fell, Aaron returned to his bench outside the chapel. The last of the guests had gone. Jason brought him a folded blanket and a second cup of coffee. "You okay?" Jason asked. Aaron looked out toward the gate, where the sun set in golden streaks. "I think I am," he said. "For the first time in a long time." Jason smiled. "Do you want to take a break? Let someone else raise the flag tomorrow." Aaron shook his head. "No. That flag deserves to see someone who remembers. Someone who lived what it means." Jason leaned back. "I hope they never forget you." Aaron took a sip of coffee, his voice low and certain. "They won't. Not anymore." As night descended, he stayed there, listening to the wind sweep across the base like an old friend. The silence was no longer hollow. It was full of voices, every name on that wall, every life remembered, every step taken with dignity. He had once been a man thought to be nobody. But now, even generals called him, Sir. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?